900,000 years ago, humanity almost didn't happen. Every single person alive today, all 8 billion of us, descended from a group so small it could fit inside a single high school. For 117,000 years, fewer than 1,300 people stood between our species and total extinction. Scientists just proved it, using DNA sitting inside your body right now. And the event that nearly erased us is still written into your genes today, whether you know it or not. Before we get into how close we came to disappearing forever, hit subscribe, because this channel uncovers the hidden science your history books never taught you. Picture the world 900,000 years ago. No cities, no farms, no written language, just small bands of early humans scattered across Africa, surviving day to day on what they could hunt and gather. It's easy to imagine this world as thriving, spreading, multiplying across continents. That is not what the evidence shows. Instead, it shows a species standing on the edge of a cliff and almost falling off it. In August of 2023, a team of researchers led by geneticists Wangjie Hu and Haiping Li published a study in the journal Science that changed how we understand our own origins. They didn't dig up a single bone. They didn't extract a single strand of fossilized DNA. Instead, they built a new mathematical tool called FitCoal, short for Fast Infinitesimal Time Coalescent Process, and they pointed it at the genomes of over 3,000 living people today. Here's the part most people don't realize. Your DNA is not just a blueprint for your body. It's a record. Every genetic variation you carry was inherited from an ancestor, who inherited it from their ancestor, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. By comparing patterns of these variations across thousands of people from Africa and beyond, scientists can essentially run time backward. They can estimate how large or small the population of our ancestors was at any point in the deep past, without ever touching an ancient bone. The oldest actual physical ancient DNA ever recovered from a human ancestor is only about 400,000 years old. Anything older than that has simply decayed away, especially in Africa, where hot, humid conditions destroy genetic material far faster than the cold, dry environments that preserve DNA elsewhere in the world. That means this entire 900,000-year story could never have been uncovered by digging in the ground. It could only be uncovered by reading the genetic echoes still carried inside living people today. In a very real sense, your own genome is a fossil, just one that happens to be walking around instead of buried in rock. This is exactly why the FitCoal method was such a breakthrough. Older techniques for estimating ancient population sizes struggle to see clearly this far back in time, especially across such a long and turbulent stretch of history. FitCoal was specifically engineered to handle these deep, ancient timescales with far greater precision, which is what allowed Hu and Li's team to detect a signal that previous methods had missed entirely. And when Hu and Li ran this analysis, the result was staggering. Somewhere between 930,000 years ago and 813,000 years ago, the population of our ancestors collapsed to somewhere around 1,280 breeding individuals. Not 1,280,000, not 1,280 million, 1,280 people. Total, holding the entire future of humanity in their hands. To put that in perspective, now that's smaller than the number of people who fit in a single Boeing 747. That's fewer people than attend an average small-town parade. And this wasn't a temporary dip. This tiny population held on, barely, for 117,000 years. For context, modern Homo sapiens as a species have only existed for around 300,000 years. This crisis lasted for over a third of that entire span, compressed into a moment when our ancestors weren't even fully human yet. The researchers estimate that at the start of this collapse, about 98.7% of the ancestral population was lost. Imagine the population of an entire country reduced to the population of a village almost overnight, and then that village barely holding on for over 100,000 years before recovering. Here's where it gets even more unsettling. Geneticist Ziqian Hao, one of the co-authors, pointed out that this bottleneck likely wiped out as much as 2/3 of the genetic diversity our ancestors once had. That number matters more than it sounds. Compare humans to almost any other species on Earth, gorillas, wolves, even fruit flies, and you'll find that humans have surprisingly low genetic diversity for a species with such an enormous global population. Scientists have wondered for years why that is. This bottleneck might be the answer. We're not just descendants of survivors. We are, genetically speaking, an extremely narrow slice of what once existed, repeated and expanded across the entire planet. Now here is a mystery this discovery might finally solve. For decades, paleoanthropologists have puzzled over a strange, frustrating gap in the human fossil record. Between roughly 950,000 and 650,000 years ago, hominin fossils become incredibly rare across Africa and Eurasia. Entire research careers have been spent trying to explain why evidence from this period is so thin, why the fossil trail seems to almost vanish for hundreds of thousands of years. The new genetic data offers a chilling explanation. It's not that fossils from this era are hiding somewhere, waiting to be dug up. It's that there simply weren't many humans alive to leave fossils behind in the first place. When your entire species is reduced to roughly the population of a small village, scattered across enormous distances, the odds of any of those individuals being preserved as a fossil millions of years later drop close to zero. The gap in the fossil record isn't a gap in our searching. It may be a scar left by the near extinction itself. And yet, the fossils that do exist from this exact window haven't been found in one single place. They turn up scattered across China, Kenya, Ethiopia, Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom, spanning an enormous geographic range. That spread is actually part of what makes this story so complicated. If our ancestors really were reduced to just over 1,000 individuals, how were early humans still leaving traces across 3 different continents during that same window? Some scientists argue this means the crisis may have hit certain regional populations far harder than others, while other groups elsewhere held on in slightly larger numbers. Others argue it means the bottleneck wasn't a single global event at all, but something more localized that later got misread as a worldwide collapse. Either way, this geographic puzzle is exactly why researchers keep saying that the genetic story needs to be tested against physical evidence in the ground, not treated as a finished conclusion on its own. So what pulled our ancestors back from the brink? Around 813,000 years ago, the population data shows something remarkable. Numbers start climbing again. And this recovery lines up almost exactly with one of the most important technological leaps in human history, the controlled use of fire for cooking. The earliest solid archaeological evidence for cooking with fire dates to around 780,000 years ago, found at a site in what is now modern-day Israel. Cooked food means more calories extracted from the same amount of resources. More calories means better survival odds, more successful pregnancies, more surviving children. It's entirely possible that mastering fire is what finally let our ancestors climb back from the edge of extinction. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how fragile that recovery really was. This wasn't a population bouncing back within a few generations. For over 100,000 years, our entire species existed as a handful of small, scattered groups, each one just a bad season, a drought, or a disease outbreak away from disappearing completely. There was no guarantee of recovery built into this story. Humanity climbing back from 1,280 individuals to a stable, growing population was not inevitable. It was, by every measure available to us, a close call that could very easily have gone the other way. Some researchers connect this same period to the evolution of larger brain size in the human lineage. Surviving such an extended crisis may have placed intense pressure on early humans to become smarter, more socially cooperative, and better at solving problems collectively, since raw numbers were no longer enough to guarantee survival. A population this small couldn't out-reproduce every threat it faced. It had to outthink them instead. But recovering in numbers wasn't the only thing that happened during this crisis. Something else may have happened to our ancestors' very biology, something written permanently into human DNA to this day. Every great ape alive today, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, carries 48 chromosomes. Humans carry 46. For decades, scientists have known that 2 of our ancestral chromosomes fused together at some point in our evolutionary past, creating what we now call human chromosome 2. What's less well known is when this fusion actually happened, and multiple independent genomic studies now place the timing of that fusion squarely inside, or right around, this same 900,000-year crisis window. Think about what that means. While our ancestors were reduced to a tiny, isolated population clinging to survival, a rare genetic mutation, a literal fusion of 2 chromosomes into one, appears to have spread through that same small group and become fixed as the new normal. In a large, spread-out population, a mutation like this would likely get diluted out, lost among the genetic diversity of millions of individuals. But in a population of just over 1,000 people, isolated and struggling to survive, an unusual mutation can spread through the entire group far more easily. Small populations don't just risk extinction, they can also accelerate rapid evolutionary change. We know this fusion happened before our lineage split into the branches that became modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans, because genetic analysis of Neanderthal and Denisovan remains shows they carried the exact same fused chromosome 2 that we do today. That split is generally estimated to have occurred somewhere between 650,000 and 800,000 years ago, placing it right at the tail end of the same population crisis. This has led some researchers to a genuinely striking hypothesis. The population that survived this bottleneck may not have simply been ordinary early humans who got lucky. They may have effectively become something new, a small, isolated group with tight social bonds and a fixed new chromosomal structure. that later split apart into 3 separate human lineages. British Museum archaeologist Nick Ashton has pointed out how remarkable it is that a population this small could survive for over 100,000 years at all, suggesting they must have lived in a very localized area with extremely strong social cohesion holding them together. In other words, the thing that may have saved humanity wasn't luck. It might have been community. There's a strange, almost poetic irony buried in this idea. The very mutation that arguably marks the biological boundary between us and the rest of the great ape family, the fusion that gave us 46 chromosomes instead of 48, may only exist today because our ancestors were pushed to the edge of extinction. If the population had stayed large and spread out, that fusion likely would have been diluted into irrelevance, one rare variant among millions of individuals, never gaining a foothold. It was the crisis itself, the extreme smallness of the surviving group, that may have allowed this mutation to become permanent, fixed into the genetic identity of every human being who has ever lived since. So what actually caused this near extinction in the first place? The timing lines up with a massive, largely unknown climate shift called the Mid-Pleistocene transition. During this period, Earth's glacial cycles fundamentally changed character. Ice ages, which had previously come and gone in shorter, milder patterns, suddenly became longer, colder, and far more extreme. Marine surface temperatures dropped. Africa and Eurasia experienced prolonged periods of intense drought. There was no single asteroid impact, no sudden volcanic winter, no dramatic single-day catastrophe. Instead, it was something arguably scarier, a slow, grinding, multi-generational deterioration of the climate that our ancestors depended on for food and water, stretched out over tens of thousands of years, quietly squeezing the population smaller and smaller until only a tiny fraction remained. Before this transition, Earth's ice ages had operated on a roughly 41,000-year cycle, driven by relatively gentle wobbles in the planet's tilt. But during the Mid-Pleistocene transition, that rhythm broke down entirely, and glacial cycles stretched out to roughly 100,000 years each, with far colder and far more punishing conditions during each glacial period. For a species already surviving hand to mouth on hunting and foraging, a shift like this wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a complete rewriting of the rules their entire way of life depended on. Familiar water sources dried up. Familiar prey animals migrated or vanished. Regions that had once reliably supported human bands may have become unlivable for generation after generation, forcing small groups into an increasingly desperate search for any pocket of land that could still support them. This is what makes the bottleneck so different from the extinction stories most people are used to hearing. There's no dramatic single moment to point to, no meteor streaking across the sky, no single volcano erupting on a single day. It's slower, quieter, and in some ways far more frightening, an entire species ground down not by one catastrophic event, but by an entire climate system turning hostile for thousands of consecutive generations, with nowhere left to run. Now, here's the part almost no other video on this topic will tell you, and it's arguably the most important piece of the entire story. This discovery is not settled science. It is an active, ongoing scientific argument happening right now in academic journals most people will never read. Since the original 2023 study came out, multiple independent research teams have challenged it directly. A paper published in the journal Genetics went so far as to argue in its own title that this bottleneck is, quote, likely a statistical artifact, end quote, meaning it might not represent a real historical event at all, but rather a mathematical illusion produced by the specific method used to detect it. Here's the problem these critics point to. The original FitCoal method detected this severe bottleneck signal in African populations, but did not detect a similar signal in non-African populations. On the surface, that might not sound strange until you remember that non-African populations split off from African populations less than 100,000 years ago, a relatively recent divergence. If this bottleneck were a real event that happened to the shared ancestors of everyone alive today, we would expect to see its genetic fingerprint in both African and non-African genomes. The fact that it only shows up in one group raises a serious statistical red flag. A separate study published in the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution ran the exact same real-world genetic data, taken directly from the 1000 Genomes Project through 2 different analytical methods. FitCoal, the original method, detected the same dramatic bottleneck, but a separate, well-established method called MUSHI, run on the exact same data, found no similar collapse at all. Same data, 2 different mathematical approaches, 2 completely different conclusions about whether humanity nearly went extinct. This is not a small technical footnote. It means 2 groups of highly qualified scientists, looking at the exact same genetic data set, walked away with fundamentally opposite conclusions about one of the most important events in human history. One team says our species came within a hair of vanishing forever. Another team, using a different but equally respected mathematical model, says the crisis may never have happened at all, and that we're looking at a mirage created by the assumptions baked into the FitCoal method itself. Other researchers have proposed entirely different explanations for the underlying genetic pattern. One alternative model, published in 2024, suggests that modern humans may actually descend from two separate ancestral populations that split apart 1.5 million years ago and then remixed together around 300,000 years ago, blending back into a single lineage. A model like this could produce genetic patterns that look, on the surface, similar to a population crash, without any actual near-extinction event ever occurring. The original authors have not backed down. As recently as this year, they published new benchmark tests defending the accuracy of their FitCoal method against these criticisms, arguing that it remains more precise than the competing approaches used to challenge it. So, as of right now, this remains a genuinely unresolved scientific debate. Some of the most respected population geneticists in the world are still arguing over whether humanity actually nearly went extinct 900,000 years ago, or whether we've been reading a ghost signal out of a flawed statistical model. And that uncertainty is, in some ways, the most fascinating part of this entire story. Science doesn't usually work in dramatic, tidy revelations. It works in exactly this kind of messy, ongoing argument, one paper challenging another, one method contradicting the next, slowly inching closer to the truth. What we're witnessing with this bottleneck debate isn't a finished discovery. It's science happening in real time, right in front of us. But even with that uncertainty hanging over the exact numbers, one thing remains true no matter which side of this debate turns out to be correct. Every piece of evidence, the fossil gap, the chromosome fusion timing, the climate data from the Mid-Pleistocene transition, all points toward the same underlying reality. At some point in our deep past, our ancestors went through an extraordinarily difficult period, survived in numbers far smaller than almost anyone would have guessed, and somehow made it through to become the 8 billion people alive on this planet today. Think about that. The next time you look at a crowded street, a packed stadium, a busy city at rush hour, every person in that crowd, every person you have ever met, every person who has ever lived, is a descendant of a group that may have numbered barely more than 1,000 people, holding on through one of the harshest chapters in our entire evolutionary history. It also puts our current moment in a strange new light. Today, humanity worries about overpopulation, about resource scarcity on a planet holding 8 billion people. 900,000 years ago, our ancestors faced the opposite nightmare, a world with almost no humans left in it at all. The distance between those two realities, from 1,280 survivors to 8 billion descendants, is one of the most extraordinary population recoveries in the history of any species on this planet, human or otherwise. We survived something we don't even fully understand yet. And the debate over exactly what happened and exactly how close we came to disappearing completely is still being written right now, one research paper at a time. If this kind of hidden history fascinates you as much as it fascinates us, make sure you're subscribed, because we dig up stories like this every single week, the parts of human history that never made it into your textbooks.